Uh, Patricia is a long-standing member of Dungannon Historical Society, and you've previously published articles in journals and a book on the history of St.
Patrick's Church,
Dungannon. So without much further ado, I just want to mention a couple of things. And I should have welcomed all those who are joining us on Zoom this evening as well. Around the Heather's Edge February schedule is also attached to the email which Aileen sent us all. So if you would like to join any of those sessions or propose a surname for review, email 810. So without any further fussing about, the floor is yours, Patricia.
Thank you, Richard. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk tonight about the Great Famine in Dungannon Union and beyond. And it's going to take the form of snapshots of what life was like for people before the famine. Were there any famines before the Great Famine of 1845 to 51? And how the famine affected the area. So without further ado, well, first of all, you'll be wondering why on earth I decided to undertake the task of trying to find information about the famine in this district. You'll be wondering to yourselves, anytime the subject ever came up in conversation over the years, people always says, oh, the famine never really affected here. It wasn't too bad. So I wondered to myself, was that true? And why should Tyrone be so different from everywhere else in Ireland? Now, we had no local papers that we could refer to from the 1840s, none round Dungannon. The only Tyrone paper at that time was the Tyrone Constitution, which began in 1844. And the Tyrone Constitution had to be very, very careful because they had to please the landlords. So they couldn't say very much about the famine in case the reports would upset the landlords, because they got a lot of good business from landlords, advertisement, all that sort of thing. So anyway, the word what do we see? You got upset the landlords. So there were few, if any obvious local stories about. Now, the rector of Killeshall, the Reverend Brett Ingram, in his book Ulster Heart, he was really shocked to find that there was little or no mention of the Great Famine in the best 3 minutes. No mention of one of the greatest disasters ever to affect Ireland, and which carried away well over 1 million people. Wanting to know more, I began digging deeply, and I managed to unearth some resources with references to Tyrone, things like old letters, occasional references to Tyrone in old newspapers, English newspapers, and other Irish newspapers. I don't have as many details as I would have liked, but I have managed to piece together many items of interest about the Great Famine in Dungannon Union and beyond for readers and listeners. Now, there are absolutely no words in the English language that could ever describe or even exaggerate the tragedy and suffering that afflicted the Irish people during the horrendous years of the Great Famine between 1845 and 1850. Ireland had had a history of serious famines caused by severe weather and crop failures. Among the earliest recorded famines in Ireland are those of 1734 to 1736, when bad harvests resulted in pestilence, disease, and death. 1740 to 41 was a very, very serious famine in Ireland, and it was caused by a great frost in the winter of 1740, and it killed all the stored potatoes that were in pits or that were in sheds or wherever they were for safekeeping. And then that summer, they had a very hot summer in 1741, when fever extracted a huge toll in that year. Scarcely a house in the whole island of Ireland escaped from tears and mourning. In a population of 2.5 million in the 1740s, at least 500,000 people died between hunger and diseases brought about by famine. There was another famine in 1798, 1800, when there were more harvest failures. The crops were deficient again in 1816 to 1821. In 1815, there was a massive volcanic eruption at Mount Tambora in Indonesia, and it darkened the whole world. And many people died from hunger and typhus because there was no sunshine to ripen the crops or ripen fruit or do anything. And Ireland in that year, in 1816, had 8 weeks solid of rain that never stopped. And as a result, many people died from hunger. The world was darkened. There were no crops that were able to mature, not in the whole world, but in a large part of the world, very bad in this area. And many died from hunger and typhus. And one of those who suffered grievously was the Reverend Charles Wolfe of Castle Caulfield. He was the curate of Donaghmore, and he lived in Caulfield. And the situation was so bad in the parish. The rector of the parish had got old at that stage. He was about 84 or 85, and he wasn't able to work. So the Reverend Wolfe had to do all the work himself. He had no car. Very often he had no horse, and he had to travel through the huge parish of Donaghmore on foot. And the situation was so bad, and he being a very conscientious young minister, he exhausted himself visiting the sick and burying the dead. And he got consumption and died the following year in 1823 at the age of 31. Now, you'll all know who the Reverend Charles Wolfe was. He wrote the most famous poem that ever was, The Burial of Sir John Moore after the Battle of Corunna. And every child at Caulfield School, Master Slevin made sure that we all learned it. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note, as his corpse to the rampart we hurried. You remember that line of it. The harvest failed again in 1831 and again in 1835 to 36. And as time went on, the misery of the population just kept on increasing. After the Great Famine of 1845 to 50, blight struck the potato crop again in 1861 and caused more hunger and misery, and again in 1879. At the root of all these catastrophes was the total dependence of the native Irish population for its survival on the potato. The highest death toll was among them. Now, on his tour of Ireland, you've always heard of Arthur Young's tour of Ireland. On his tour of Ireland in 1776, the agriculturalist Arthur Young observed that while the rich in Ireland were living in splendour, it was the reverse for the labouring people. There was great oppression of the poor by gentlemen and farmers. Labouring people were treated with great harshness and cruel abuse. He remarked that Catholics had only 5% of the land of Ireland. That was in the 1770s. Even though they formed 3/4 of the population. This decline was due almost entirely to the effects of severe penal laws. Now, all this sort of misery brings beggars. And in 1785, the local beggars in Donaghmore, in Castle Caulfield, because that's all in the same parish, they were badged. There were so many beggars about that every parish sort of badged their own beggars. And that allowed them to receive alms from the parish coffer. This distinguished them from wandering vagrants who, if found in the parish, were severely dealt with. You can imagine if you were one of the vagrants, they would be after you with a big stick. Now, what was the cause of all these woes and miseries? One of the major reasons for the woes of the Irish agricultural population was the use of middlemen by landlords. They were avaricious land speculators who had been leasing farmland from mostly absentee landlords from about the mid-18th century. And then they would sublet the land at an increased rent. The use of middlemen was considered one of the most manifest evils in the Irish agricultural system. It ensured a landlord's profit without the responsibilities of letting land. And quite often there were tiers of middlemen involved, as the subtenant, who instead of working the land themselves, they rented it out, and they thus became middlemen themselves. This resulted in a sort of a pyramid system with the unfortunate tenant at the bottom who had no means of redress. Another source of profit for the middleman was the auction of lands, either when the lease fell due or when a tenant couldn't pay the rent, they were able to make a bit of more money for themselves. And he also had the opportunity to raise the rent of a smallholder, but also to split the ground of, say that he could come along and split your wee farm into smaller units. He had that power. The existence of middlemen prevented the landlord from raising his rent, but he was living nicely away abroad somewhere with his heat and everything nice. At the bottom of the pile of the agricultural population was the cottier. I remember when I was a child, my aunt used to talk about people, cotters. They were cotters and they lived in a cotter house, but she was really meaning cottiers. Now, the poor old cottier, he was a labourer whose rent for a cabin and about an acre and a half of land was often paid for in labour rather than money. The land wasn't enough to sustain him and his family, in potatoes. Why, the land was enough to sustain him and his family in potatoes, to keep a cow, a pig and some poultry. The cottier existed at subsistence level because of high rents driven by demand for land. You see, the population, there was an explosion in the population at this time because of early marriage. These labourers and their families wore clothes cast off by farmers, and their poor clothing kept them away from church on a Sunday. In some parishes, Protestant labourers had their children baptised at home because they could not attend church in their rags. Some of these cottiers became migrant labourers. They would have gone away to England and Scotland at times, harvest times, and they were able to earn a bit of money at that, because they didn't have enough money because of the absence of full-time work. A steady increase in the population in the early decades of the 19th century aggravated the situation of cottiers even worse. There had been massive poverty in Ireland for decades. In the 1830s, several travel writers came to Ireland to report on the situation. All were absolutely horrified by the deprivation that they witnessed. Henry Inglis reported, "The destitute, infirm and aged form a large body of the population of the cities, and 3/4 of them die through the effects of destitution, either by decay of nature, accelerated, or through disease introduced by scanty or unwholesome food, or by the attack of epidemics. The condition of this class is shocking to behold." It was a large class. It was shocking for humanity to contemplate, and beyond the efforts of private benefice, there would be no one person could help to alleviate the suffering. And it is a reproach on any civilized and Christian country to have people in such a condition. The state of the agricultural labourers throughout Ireland is scarcely less deplorable, said Henry Inglis. Among the whole of this class, almost the whole of this class live on the verge of starvation. The real and true cause of want is want of employment, and the country's in a very disturbed state. This is when you had the Yoke Boys and all sorts of people, and the white, I forget what you called them. There were all sorts of groups gathered up. No wonder the country was in a disturbed state, and it's the duty of the government to do something, but of course the government never did anything. Now, the Dungannon landlords, they were the Ranfurly family, and they were absentee landlords. And in 1832, they were living in Paris, and they had a governess for their little girl, and she was a German lady, and she was called Baroness von Dobeneck. And the Ranfurly family were living in Paris in 1832. And in the summer of 1832, Lady Ranfurly came into the nursery to Baroness von Dobeneck, and she said to her, "We're all going to Ireland." So everybody was very excited that they were going to Ireland, including the Baroness. And all during the journey to the rest of France and up through England, she wrote to her father nearly every day. He lived in Germany. And she wrote to him telling him how beautiful England was and all the rest. But then she came to Ireland and she was really horrified. Well, Dublin, they came to Dublin first, and it was nothing but funerals. 1832, everybody was dying from cholera. And that was rather a depressing sight. Now, she came to she writes frequently during her time travelling to her father in Germany. And in recent years, she wrote in German, of course. In recent years, her letters were translated to English by Cork University. And she came to Dungannon Park with the Ranfurly family, but she was horrified by what she saw. This is a wee bit from one of her letters from Dungannon. She was told never to go outside Dungannon Park. That was their yard, that was their gardens and their estate. So she says, today I have transgressed again. In other words, or committed a sin again. I have again transgressed the order not to venture outside the park and into the area of the poor hovels. In front of these miserable dwellings, there were a few women sitting, cradling their dirty children on their laps. I entered a hut and find myself in a corner that serves as a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room in one. Just it was a one bed hut, sort of a mud hut with a thatched roof on it. Those are the sort of houses people lived in Dungannon. When I spoke, a woman got such a fright that she left the hut in a hurry. A girl hid behind a bundle of straw in the corner, and all my efforts to make friends with her were in vain. She says about Ireland, I could enumerate a lot of injustices, but it only makes me sad. When I think of Ireland, I'm close to crying. Any travel journal about this country must finally dissolve into a sigh and a tear. Now we're going to look, that was 1832, what things were like. This is 2 years later, 1834, the Ordnance Survey memoirs. A wee quick look at those. The first one's from Pomeroy in 1834, and it described the appearance of the town as bleak and miserable in the extreme. At the fair, a few horses are sold, but they have a very bad description. So you can imagine how awful that would have been. Killeshall. In 1834, there was no town or village in the parish of Killeshall. The cottages are poor and uncomfortable. The parish has a bleak and wild appearance and is in every sense a poor country. There's no town or even village belonging to this parish, and the inhabitants carry their produce to neighbouring markets of Ballygawley and Dungannon, maybe walked, maybe they had a horse, I don't know. There's neither bleach green nor manufacturing in the parish. There are 4 corn mills, and you all know where one of them is. And the population of the parish is about 5,000. That was 1834. In the early 1830s, the diet of hired labourers and weavers in the parish of Desert Crate, not far from Dungannon, was potatoes and salt, perhaps enriched with butter or milk in the summertime. Middling farmers lived on potatoes, flourabout, and oaten bread for most of the year. The better class farmer had this all year round, and now and again had a treat of chicken meat or bacon and cabbage in season, plus peas and beans. The farmers in that parish were also manufacturers of linen. That was called the home linen. That's before there were linen factories or weaving factories. People were all weaving at home in these wee cottages. The farmers in that parish of Desert Crate were also manufacturers of linen, the weaving being carried out by their children or hired weavers. Now, this is what it was like in Killyman parish. In the parish of Killyman, most of the cottages were made from mud and thatched, mostly 1 story with 2 rooms. Little attention was paid to comfort or cleanliness. The chief food in Killyman was potatoes, oatmeal and bacon. So what were the government going to do about all this? How were they going to rectify the horrible situation? In 1838, the Poor Law Ireland Act was introduced to tackle poverty. And as part of that plan, the country was divided into poor law unions. And in each union, a workhouse was built for the poor. Dungannon Union Workhouse was built between 1840 and 42 by the Lilburns of Dungannon, were a firm of builders. And it was built to accommodate 800 paupers. The workhouse was a type of prison system for the poor. Ireland needed a different system of workhouse from England. We got the English type of workhouse, but we needed a different type. The workhouses in England was a system for the poor who wouldn't work. You see, you had the Industrial Revolution in England and there were plenty of jobs. The Irish poor were anxious to work, but there was no work for them except farm labour, and that was seasonal. And the wages were totally inadequate to sustain a family. People's lives were very insecure and very miserable, and still the population kept on increasing. Now, Dungannon Poor Law Union It covered an area of 160 square miles. It's quite a big area. And inside that union, there were 19 electoral divisions. There was Anahoe, Altmore, Ballymagran, Berna, Brantry, Castle Caulfield, Clonanese, Crossdernet, Derrygardravy, Drumaspel, Donaghmore, Dungannon, Meena, Minterburn, Mountjoy, Moy, and Tullyniskin. And if you're looking at the workhouse records of the people who were born in the workhouse and people who died in the workhouse, you'll see people from all those unions. Names from all those unions that died in the workhouse. Now, that's the Poor Law Ireland Act. It wasn't a great way of tackling poverty, but I don't know. Anyway, it wasn't going to be adequate when the Great Famine came. 1841 census details from the 1841 census show that 46% of the population of Ireland lived in a single room, and sometimes 2 or 3 families occupied the same room. 36% of the population in towns lived in one room, again with 2 or 3 families frequently in the same room. The agricultural population suffered greatest deprivation and hardship, being dependent on precarious employment for subsistence. This after the union with the richest and most industrialized country on earth, over 40 years after the Act of Union, when the English Parliament took over looking after Ireland. Irish people were not to blame for their misery. The condition of the agricultural population was miserably wretched, all on a diet of potatoes and water, all in a state of starvation. It would be impossible to describe adequately the sufferings of the people. Cabins that do not protect them against the weather, inadequate, everybody slept on a bed of straw, inadequate straw for a bed and no bedclothes. An average life expectancy of 40 years, while the country produced such abundance that inhabitants were starving. The abundance was all the good food was being exported. Now, here's 1842, life in Clonaux parish. This is what it was like in Clonaux when the Reverend William Atwell came as the rector in 1842. He found all tenants, with 2 or 3 exceptions, were wretched paupers, living in the poorest hovels, tottering fast to ruin, and some of which have since fallen. The home of a saddler in Castle Caulfield called James Lochern, who died from the horse-diseased landers, was described as a little cabin about 12 feet square, and he lived in it along with his wife, 2 sons, 1 daughter, an old horse, a cow, and 2 pigs. The inhabitants of the house, except for their wearing apparel, their clothes, and it was poor, had had no cover for 7 years. They'd had no roof for 7 years. The Locherns, who were probably cottiers, had a roofless cottage, and like many cottiers, the farmer who owned their house never bothered to repair it for them. So you had that there, that type of a life. Then you had evictions. And this is on the Ranfurly estate in 1843. 50 distraints have been made on the above estate during the last few months, and more severely to harass these poor people. A watchman in every instance has been set to guard their property, for which they're charged as 1 in 6 a week, which is a serious amount of money in those days. In the above instance, the harshness practiced is uncalled for, because almost all these people are tenants at will. They know perfectly well if they attempted to move their goods, they would incur the displeasure of the dreaded agent, and in a few months be dispossessed of their holdings. People were terrified of the agents, the landlord's agents. They were very cruel. The only object in acting like this was to extort money from these wretched people already in the lowest state of poverty. Now, where James Brown is one of the local people who's helpful, tells us one of the few people who tells us a little bit about the famine. He was born in 1823. James Brown of Donaghmore informs us, they were the people who made the soap and the candles. He informs us that wages were very low before the 1847 famine. 4 shillings a week was the wage for a labouring man. That's 40 pence in our money. My father always paid his men 5 shillings. Some farmers gave their men food instead of wages. And I was told by a man in Oma of a neighbour of his who hired his men out on these terms, but wouldn't feed them on Sundays and gave them a penny instead. Servant girls were paid as low as 5 shillings a quarter, that's for 3 months. But from May to November, when food was dear, many were glad to work for their board without any wages. After the famine, emigration increased greatly and wages have never been so low since. So the arrival of the Great Famine in autumn, it began in autumn 1845, when a potato blight, can't pronounce the first word, that travelled on ships of potatoes from South America to Europe, with the first famine starting in mainland Europe. So the blight first came to Ireland from South America in the autumn of 1845. And some people died in mainland Europe as well from famine, but not as many as Ireland. The prevailing conditions in Ireland, it was sort of wet and damp, meant a rapid spread of the disease throughout the whole country, causing mass starvation, disease and death between 1845 and 1850. The main problems being that the Irish relied on the potato crop more than any other nation. There is existing abject poverty of the tenant farmer and the intransigent British rulers. Now, James Brown tells us about the famine coming to Donaghmore. He tells James Brown of Donaghmore Soap and Candle Factory tells us that in October 1845 came the first potato blight. We had a field of potatoes that year on the back lane, and in the night they were struck with blight, and both roots and crops were blackened. The damage done was only partial, that's to say that only a portion of the country was affected, and the blight did not strike the plants until they were almost matured. Only a part could be used for food, the rest was fed to pigs or used to make starch, and the Browns being entrepreneurs, they made starch. And he says, we put up a small machine and extracted the farina out of the potatoes, and for this purpose they served well. On the night of the 3rd of August, 1846, came the bad potato blight. And he says, I remember driving to Bundoran through Fermanagh, he would have been with a horse and trap, and he had his sister Bella with him, and Bella was Mrs. Atchison from Castle Caulfield. She was Brown of Donaghmore, James Brown's sister. And on August the 3rd, and as we went along seeing the fine crops of potatoes in the fields, that was August the 3rd, we were coming back we spent 3 days in Bundoran. It was a long journey from Donaghmore to Bundoran in those days with a horse. We spent 3 days in Bundoran, and on our way home found the same crops blackened and useless. In 3 days, all those beautiful potato crops were ruined. The same state of affairs prevailed practically over the whole of Ireland, and in consequence, 1847 was the famine year. It was felt severely here, but not just as bad as in the south and west. Indian corn and meal were introduced for the first time from America, and he remembers the poor people coming into Brown's shop and asking to see the yellow meal. Can we have a look at the yellow meal? And they would take some in their hand, ostensibly to look at it as a novelty, but really to satisfy their hunger with it. Now, obviously, ate it when they got a wee bit. A relief committee was formed in Donaghmore, which met in the schoolhouse at the Cross, and contributions were raised for the relief of the worst cases. In other parts, works were begun, such as cutting hills on roads, but they were found to be a wasteful and useful means of relief, and eventually the government made a grant to be used directly to supply the starving people with food. That would have been the soup kitchens, and they only lasted a short time. Now, there was a relief meeting in Dungannon in 1846 that would have written October 1846 that would have needed an awful lot earlier. But anyway, they met in October 1846. Dr. Montague, the parish priest of Dungannon, was there, and he said there were about 500 persons in Dungannon town who were not in constant work, and about 200 distressed persons who couldn't work. Lord Ranfurly, he was proposing that he would look after his own tenants. He didn't think that Lord Ranfurly's proposal to look after his own tenants could prevent starvation. There were already 420 inhabitants in the poorhouse, and it would not hold a quarter of those requiring relief. There was room for 800 in it. but there was a massive amount of people needed help. He would suggest that they would be supported in their little huts. The Reverend Queen agreed with Dr. Montague that there were a great number of widows and orphans to be relieved, but it was very difficult to persuade them to go into the workhouse. Poor people were absolutely terrified of the workhouses, and not a bit of wonder. He couldn't induce them to do so, and it was hard when the house would hold 800, that they could not induce more than 400 to accept relief in it. So it was agreed that they would ask for presentment sessions for public works, and they eventually got £5,000 granted to Dungannon Union, but it was totally inadequate for such a disastrous situation. Now, there's another wee bit about Dungannon, another wee snapshot. We have been informed that a spirit has already manifested itself in this neighbourhood, similar to that which we published as occurring in the south and west of Ireland. Yesterday, a large body of poor people threatened an attack on the mills of Mr. Barcroft of Berna near Dungannon. They were obviously ravenous with hunger. They also manifested a disposition not only to attack other mills in the neighbourhood, but to come into town and ransack the shops. The police have been called on to interfere and protect the property at risk. There were many incidents of this nature in a country where people were starving to death. A boatload of meal leaving Newry port was surrounded by hordes of desperate people, and a battalion of soldiers was mobilised, and they managed to get the boat and its cargo out of the harbour safely. So the poor, the hunger, they had to stay hungry. And then another canal boat belonging to Mr. Dargan. We always know who the famous Mr. Dargan was, who made the canals. And the boat, it was his boat, and it was carrying flour from Tandragee Mill and was resting at Madden Bridge on Newry Canal, and it was attacked by 30 armed men who stole 5 tons of flour from it. There were very few policemen in Newry, so the flour wasn't recovered in spite of search of houses. A policeman's face in Newry was described as being as scarce as a good potato in that town. So there weren't many police around. All the best grain and other foods were leaving Ireland for markets in England, and the poor of Ireland had no access to it. They had to make do with inferior yellow meal, which was hard to grind. I think it had to be ground twice, and it was deficient. Our mills weren't suitable for grinding yellow meal, so it had to be ground twice, and was deficient in vitamin C, among other things. So the relief committees were formed in October 1846. They were expected to provide food financed from local relief funds, which the government is supported by. So the people on the relief committee would go around the whole parish and collect as much money as they could get. And if they got £80, say that they managed to gather up £80, then the government matched that with £80. They didn't give anybody any more. And some parishes couldn't even raise £80. Important residents like gentry, clergy and others made up the committees, and they were expected to raise the subscriptions, purchase food and provide employment. By early 1847, Dungannon Relief Committee was supplying 350 families a week with meal at a penny a pound. That would be yellow meal, and they would have taken it home and made stirabout. A soup kitchen with large boilers was established, and it distributed soup to multitudes at a halfpenny a quart. A lot of people were quietly dying in their own houses because they were ashamed to beg. In those days, there was a lot of tut-tutting about anybody who would beg, you know. So a lot of people allowed themselves to die rather than beg. The population of the Union was 66,000, and the number of persons who had received relief in Dungannon Union varied between 2,500 to 13,082. The number of impotent poor who received relief has been 3,910, and that of able-bodied with their families 9,172. Dungannon Workhouse in 1847, a newspaper reported that instead of a person having a contract for coffins, there are now 2 carpenters at work in Dungannon Workhouse for that purpose. So there are a lot of people dying in the workhouse in 1847. Right, mortality in Dungannon Workhouse Newspapers reported on mortality at Dungannon workhouse. We deeply regret to learn that the number of deaths in the workhouse at Dungannon is greatly on the increase. 100 of the inmates having died within the last month. Dr. Doc Dawson, the medical attendant of the fever ward, has fallen victim to the fever. In other words, he has died. And then there's another man has died, the Reverend David Bennett. He was the Presbyterian minister of Dungannon, and he caught typhus fever in the discharge of his duty, and he died at the age of 65. And here's another doctor reported from Ballyshannon area. A doctor who had worked in Ballyshannon area reported that when people died during the typhus epidemic, they were buried straight away to avoid infection. He protested that they were being buried too soon before they were dead. And he had some of them exhumed and found that they had turned in their coffins. So there were all sorts of awful things happening. Outdoor relief, well, that's where we see a lot of cases of people needing relief. Now, a rare wee glimpse of Dungannon during the famine, and this comes from the obituary of Dr. Montague, who died at quite a young age during the famine. This information comes from the obituary of the Reverend John Montague, the very distinguished parish priest of Dungannon, who died after a short illness in June 1848, his death being due to the stress of the famine. During the present distress, Dr. Montague's sympathies for the suffering poor cost him sacrifices of more than one kind. Daily, he spent hours in attendance at relief committees or in aiding to carry out the arrangements adopted for mitigating the privations of the distressed. There were very few days that he would not add considerable sums to his former and for his means very large subscriptions to enable some wretched creatures to obtain a portion of the food distributed at soup kitchens. So you needed money to get food at a soup kitchen, around which were to be seen at frequent times groups of persons visibly suffering from hunger, but unable to find the mite required by the committee to be paid for each one's dole of relief. Such a spectacle was too affecting not to touch a kind heart like his, etc. To gain time for the performances of these charitable offices, Dr. Montague was to be found in his chapel, occupied by his ecclesiastical duties from 4 o'clock every morning. Now we're going to come nearer to Kilesha. We're going to talk about the Burgess estate at Parkanore. The Burgess estate comprised the 5 townlands of Edencrannon, Terrynew, Stackerna, Tullyallen and Killymoyle, formerly in Donaghmore parish, but by 1846, part of Kilesha parish. This very important information reflects the experiences and thoughts of John Einar Burgess about the great catastrophe of the famine at his estate in the Parkanore district of Castle Caulfield, and it comes from his Chronicles of Parkanore, and if anybody wants to see them, they're in the Armagh County Museum. Now, they're very well worth reading. And he's Parkanore, 1846. Everyone's attention was directed to the feeding of the people. Mr. Labouche's Act was first in force at this time. That's the man who was looking after all the different schemes that, improvement schemes that were to be done by the poor. There was a meeting in Dungannon to put it into effect. Some were violently opposed to it. That's when they got the £5,000, as throwing too much of a burden on the landlord's shoulders. Others thought that they could not take too much of the government's money. I believe in many cases it was misapplied. Roads were made that led to no place and were never completed. And there were people working on those roads who weren't fit to work. They were so starving with hunger. A lot of them would have died. Labourers were paid who never worked, and work was done that wasn't wanted. However, the people were employed and did not starve during the winter. I never saw their minds more exasperated against the gentlemen, as if the landlords had brought this famine upon them, who all the time were doing their utmost to help them. Now, death in Dungannon streets. The Reverend Thomas T.A. Dixon, or the Honourable Thomas T.A. Dixon MP, who was born in Scotch Street, Dungannon in the early 1830s, a bright boy whose mother taught him and his brothers to read, had asked his parents one day why people were dying of hunger in the streets of Dungannon during the famine. I don't know what her answer would have been. So T.A. Dixon's brother, John Gervin Dixon, he died from famine fever in 1847. T.A. Dixon gave his grandson, Major T.C. Dixon, an account of his brother's death and conveyed to him even more harrowing tales of the deaths of famine victims found dead in the gutters of Scotch Street, Dungannon. So if anybody in Collegial Historical Society wants to do a bit of research into the famine, they could do no better than to look at the Dixon archives in the Public Records Office to see what those accounts would say. Because of the pandemic, I never got to them down to Proney. Now, this is Donaghmore Parish. This is what Father Devlin said, Father Francis Devlin, April 1847. Their mortality of this parish very likely would have been much more appalling were it not for the sources of private benefits open to us on the 27th of October last. That was the Relief Committee, by which we were enabled to sell meal at a penny a pound to the industrial middle class poor, and gratis to the very poor, free to the very poor. But 300 families then purchasing at this rate up to the opening of the relief committees as by law could not now purchase any. They, with 500 more families, are exhausted, have no money or any possible means of procuring it. Our state then is getting much worse and far more alarming. Fever and dysentery in every third house in the parish and on the increase daily. The rations given being very little, in general, more than one half of the government standard. So the people weren't really getting enough even of the rations. The deaths have increased 30% in the last 40 days. Some landlords and middlemen are starving their poor tenants out of their holdings and tumbling down their cottages. This was in Donaghmore. The fields are cropped in general about 1/10 of the usual quantity of potatoes. Unless some stringent law is quickly passed to stay the desolating angel bearing off the poor people, I cannot see where woe will end. So now this is the wee quote from a Scottish newspaper. It's true, the government has provided abundance of Indian maize as food for the people. Ships deeply freighted are daily landing in the harbours of Ireland, and mills are regularly preparing it for use. But without the means of purchasing it, it is denied to famishing thousands, and only as a mockery to them in their destitution. Amid this state of things, the evictions of tenantry goes on without fear or hindrance. Now, I happened to find a man in America sent me Mrs. Mary Tanner's letters from the 1840s. She was living at Moree House in the Rock, and she corresponded with a lady friend in Dublin. She was in a house full of men. She had 7 sons and her husband, and she was the only woman among them. So she had this friend in Dublin that she used to write to on a regular basis. Now, in December 1845, things are starting to look not so good. She makes a brief comment about trouble on an estate in Cavan that was starting to spread. That would be discontent because people were hungry. That was the first year of the famine. Later in the month, she comments on how good the crops have been, all but the potato. But if the poor get employment, they'll be able to procure food. I keep a little boy picking the good from the bad, so that we can have a large dish of bruised potatoes called champ here. So, and this is October 1846. There's a good deal of fever throughout the country from want of food and bad potatoes, and we fear that there will be much more distress. Last Wednesday, 40 fierce fellows went to Sister Watson's, demanding, this is in the Rock. We had George Watson in our historical society, and this would be his family. So, but unfortunately, poor George didn't live to hear this bit about the famine in his area. Last Wednesday, 40 fierce fellows went to Sister Watson's demanding money and food, and threatened to burn the place and throw Mr. Watson into the river. He gave them 6pence each, but they were very dissatisfied and said they would return. So now the winter of 1847 was a bitterly, bitterly cold, frosty winter. And Mrs. Tanner's writing to her friend again. And it's the winter of 1847, and it was unusually harsh. February 1847, 'tis very, very cold indeed, much more so than in Dublin. Her friend lived in Dublin. The lawns have been covered in a deep carpet of snow for weeks. The fires almost fail to warm the house, and alas, the door is often thronged with starving poor, though Tyrone is said to be much better off than most other counties. It's very distressing. So isn't that sad, all the hungry people around the door, you know? Emigration during the famine. People were forced to emigrate to make way for a change in agriculture on landed estates from arable to grazing. Landlords decided that they might be better off, instead of having people ploughing the land, to use the land for grazing, and the government was in support of this. Some of the landlords in the neighbourhood of Dungannon, it says, are assisting their poorer tenants to emigrate. This is a sound policy for all parties concerned. The small farmer, if he carries with him across the Atlantic industrious habits and a spirit of perseverance, he'd make a good exchange from struggling penury to comfort and independence. From every part of Ulster, the middling and small farmers are leaving in hundreds, seeking a future home on the other side of the Atlantic. The English and Scotch steamers carry weekly huge numbers for Liverpool and Glasgow, the impatience to leave Ireland being so great. Some were leaving from Portrush, as well as Derry and Belfast. What was happening round about Castle Caulfield and Parkinore, Major Burgess tells us, it was really harassing to the feelings to see so many that you had once known in health and strength perishing before your eyes without the means of saving them. Some children we had remembered well in youth and beauty, wasting away. Several living on weeds and nettles and anything they could get just to keep a life within them. This was Castle Caulfield area. Lady Caroline appointed soup supplies in many directions, and all that we could devise was done for our people. More than 300 people left Parkinore Estate at this time. Now, whether it was 300 families or 300 individuals, we don't know. Besides attending the poorhouse, John Einar Burgess, he was on the committee, he was a guardian of the poorhouse. Besides attending the poorhouse, we had a provisional committee at Castle Caulfield, and it was called the Castle Caulfield, Eden Crannan Castle Caulfield Committee. And he never missed going, but he always brought some port with him and a biscuit. And he thought it protected him from getting any disease, because they all went to the workhouse for their meetings, the guardians, and they were all terrified of getting some disease in it. So he brought some port and some biscuits, and he thought that helped him. Anyway, forgotten faces. Wait till you hear what happened to the people. All the old women that used to haunt the roads disappeared. Even when I was a child, there were all sorts of strange women and men on the roads. Lizzie Push and all sorts of people. And not an old man was to be seen. They had all died, obviously. I met one day a family on the road going into the poorhouse. They were actually skin and bone. Now, this was maybe were from Killeshill walking to the poorhouse. We don't know. Or to the workhouse. They were actually skin and bone, and the faces of the poor children were expressionless, as if reason had departed. The body just left without the mind. With all these sad scenes before my eyes, I found in the month of July that my own health began to wane. I found the least exertion very hard upon me. In August, I left this scene of responsibility at Castle Caulfield, responsibility and trial for a holiday in Scotland. So he tried to do his best. Now, what we say, this is from an English newspaper, and it's about emigration. Immense numbers of farmers, this is March 1847, immense numbers of farmers are preparing to leave Ireland for America. The Leinster Express on this day says, the extent of emigration from Ireland to America this year is likely to exceed tenfold that of any former period. The small farmers who are unable to provide sufficient means are leaving in thousands. Upon one estate in Kilkenny, 400 families are preparing to depart this month and propose forming a colony among themselves on the other side of the Atlantic. In County Tipperary, we've been informed that one landlord is purchasing at £5 to £10 per acre the holding of tenants who occupy under 20 acres. His object being to obtain possession of his property and save it from being pauperised, after which he will form 100-acre farms to be let to tenants of capital who will be able to cultivate the land properly and make an independent livelihood. This was a common thought, that if they got rid of all their tenants and made these big farms, a lot of people would come in from England and start to farm those, but apparently that never happened. In fact, as the county is at present circumstanced, only half of farmers in Ireland could not maintain themselves. In fact, as the county is at present circumstanced, one half of farmers in Ireland could not maintain themselves if given their land without any rent. Until capital and labour are applied to the soil, it is idle to talk of our agricultural resources. So everybody was on their knees. This is 1848. Emigration from Ireland. Immense numbers of persons, principally from the class of small farmers, are leaving daily from America. Late as the season is, the tide of emigration is considerably greater than in the spring of summer. Emigrants were sort of warned not to be going to New York in the wintertime, and even not going to Quebec because of the frost and frozen water, and they would have to maintain themselves, eat the food that they brought, or use up the wee bit of money they brought with them to feed themselves, and maybe end up in the workhouse in America. Right, let me see. Now, immigrants from Skye, Donegal, you've a girl in your among your Canadian members, and this is her family. Immigrants from Skye in the Dungannon district. You've often heard of Skye eggs. It's just a wee bit up the road from Donegal on the Pomeroy Road. In May 1847, a case was highlighted in the press of a man called James Black of Skye near Dungannon, who had paid a deposit of £5 to a Belfast emigration agent to secure the passage to Quebec for himself and 75 of his neighbours. The rate was £3 and 5 shillings per adult and £1.12 and 6 for children under 14. Infants travelled free. The parties sold their goods and prepared for the voyage. But then a dispute erupted with the emigration agent about the booking, and the whole thing ended up in court. And I often wondered what had happened, but now I know what happened. The court advised the group to sort out the problem among themselves, and eventually the Skye party made their way to Quebec in 1847, and they settled at Inishfill in Simcoe County in Canada. Apparently it had only opened up about 20 years earlier, and some of their descendants are there to this day in Sweden, including people called Culbert from this part of the country. They were obviously related. I think they were married into the Blacks of Skye. So the lady in question is Susan. You know Susan? Yes, yeah. This dispute made it to the newspapers. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known about such large parties leaving Tyrone at this time. This is what I say about the shortage of information. And here's the thing about the Benburb district. In a district between Benburb and Napa, covering about 3 miles, there were no less than 7 town lands covering an area of 1,000 acres, totally unoccupied. Everybody had gone. This was in the spring of 1849. 2 or 3 years earlier, this district was inhabited by a comparatively wealthy population. The occupants had gone before their savings had been completely exhausted by payment of the poor rates, before they too became, you see, the government put the poor rates onto the poor farmers. Well, they put it probably onto the landlords first, and the landlords transferred it to the farmers. And people couldn't afford to pay it, otherwise they would become destitute. Charles Shields of the Shields Institutes, as you all know about. Charles Shields was born in Killock, County Down, and early in life he emigrated to Liverpool, and he became a very wealthy merchant there. When he had amassed his fortune, he returned home to Ireland in 1850, where he became greatly disturbed at the poverty and destitution of its people, in particular the plight of women who had come to the end of their working life, and for many of them there was nothing but the workhouse. So he allocated £250,000 in his will to set up 5 sets of houses: Killaloch, Dungannon, Dublin, Enniskillen, and there's a couple of other places. And each set of houses had 20 houses in it. So that was 100 houses. His wife had been from Dungannon district. She was a Miss Newton, and she was related to the Atchisons of Castle Caulfield. And Peter Atchison is Peter Newton Atchison. The ladies would live rent-free in these wee houses and get 4 tons of coal annually free, plus £5 annually for light and medical attention. In fact, Charles Shields gave all his fortune for the relief of distress in Ireland. He and his wife had no children, and his wife had predeceased him. So you're all familiar with the Shields Institute. Myths about the famine in Ulster. This is, where do we see? By 1849, 2 years past the peak year 47, the myth was already being circulated. The Newry Telegraph put it like this: it's true that the potato has failed in Connacht and Munster, but it has failed as much in Ulster. Therefore, if the potato had caused all the distress in the south and west, why has it not caused the same misery here? It's because we are a painstaking, industrious, laborious people who desire to work and pay our just debts, and the help of the mighty is upon our labour. If the people of the south had been equally industrious with those of the north, they would not have had so much misery among them. Oh dear. So that's a myth, and that myth has been exploded in recent times by people like Trevor Parker, Christine Keneally, and Jared McAtasney. And really, Protestants and Catholic poor were equally affected, you know. Right. Oh, where do we see what this is? Yes, another piece about exceptionalism in Ulster, famine in Ulster. This is in 1846. Gradually, the fearful evil hunger that has long been preying in silence on the poor of Ulster is attracting attention of the humane Lord Londonderry's prayer against relief committee. Lord Londonderry obviously didn't want relief committees, and the determination of the grand jury in Down not to appoint any extraordinary presentment sessions, with some similar proceedings to show for Ulster's honour that hunger has not visited it. Stifled appeals for relief, or even the poor tried to make it a point of honour to bear up against the destitution, in other words, to die of hunger. The distress in Ballymacarrett was the first cry of want that unhinged the fine philosophy that would starve the poor for the honour of the rich. Now, I will see what else is there. I hope you're not bored today. I haven't heard any snores yet. Yeah. Right. Here's another thing. Oh yes, we've seen that one. Here's a letter from a correspondent in County Down to one of the newspapers. Sir, you would confer a great favour on people in general if you would explain in your valuable journal what proportion of the money assessed on the baronies at extraordinary presentment sessions will have to be paid by the tenant and what by the landlord. Some of the landlords here in County Down have impressed on the minds of the tenantry that they, the tenantry, must pay back the money, and by this means have rendered them averse to the presentments, whence the poor are in great distress, as in many places have no employment, and where employment is given, the pay is generally only 10pence a day. There is great and appalling distress in the county of Down. The wealthy and extensive landlords don't want to hear anything about it. It's very disagreeable to them. I know of one instance of death from starvation. The victim was an able-bodied man willing to work if he could find employment. More, perhaps, of this again. The landlord ought to give employment or else not prevent the extraordinary presentment session. Now, there's a massive amount of work to be done, all you historians, in your own areas, to find out a bit more about the famine, you know. It's a sort of a thing So that's all I'm going to say tonight. You'll be pleased to hear.
Not at all, Patricia, it's,
It gives you an idea of what life was like.
but there's so much work has gone into that, and you've collated it really, really well.
Oh, well, thank you.
And